The night was silent, but the sea seemed to tremble. It was October 24th, 1,944 inches, the narrow waters of the Surigao Strait. Out of the darkness came the low growl of engines, 3 Packard V 12 seconds, snarling inside a fragile wooden hull, propelling a boat no longer than 80 feet at more than 40 knots. The men aboard called her simply a PT, a patrol torpedo boat. The Japanese called them something else, devil boats. Ahead loomed giants of steel battleships, Yamashiro and Fuso, each bristling with 14-inch guns and thick armor that could shrug off the shells of a cruiser. By every measure of naval warfare, the contest should have been hopeless. A mosquito daring to bite an elephant, and yet these young American sailors were about to do exactly that. Radar screens flickered with distant echoes. The order crackled contact bearing 010 Pite enemy ships inbound. The PT skippers knew they had mere minutes to act. Torpedoes were rolled into firing position, heavy cylinders packed with nearly 600 pounds of Torpex explosive. Sweat dripped as fingers tightened on release levers. Suddenly, Japanese searchlights split the night, painting the sea in ghostly white beams. Heavy shells roared geysers, erupting all around. Still the PTs charged forward, weaving between plumes, daring fate for one clear shot. To the Japanese lookouts, it must have been surreal. Tiny silhouettes of wooden boats darting out of the shadows, spitting fire, then vanishing into the blackness. For every battleship shell hurled in anger, a swarm of mosquitoes answered with speed, audacity, and torpedoes that could cripple even the mightiest warship. This was the unlikely dual gallant mosquito boats against the titans of the Imperial Navy. And that night, the course of battle in the Pacific was about to change forever. In the early years of World War II, the United States Navy faced a daunting challenge. Its capital ships were precious few in number and often too large to maneuver safely in the shallow waters and twisting channels of the Pacific's countless islands. Japan's war machine was advancing with terrifying momentum, sweeping across Southeast Asia, threatening to dominate the Pacific with heavy cruisers and battleships. America needed something fast, daring, and expendable vessels that could strike where larger ships could not, that could sting the enemy, delay convoys, and scout out the movements of a powerful adversary. Out of this urgent need was born the patrol torpedo boat, soon known to friend and foe alike as the PT. The PT boats were unlike anything the US Navy had ever relied upon before. They were tiny compared to the steel monsters of the fleet, 70 to 80 feet in length, displacing less than 60 tons, and built primarily of mahogany planks fastened by thousands of brass screws. Where an Iowa-class battleship weighed more than 4,500 tons, a PT boat was smaller than a harbor tug. But they carried within their fragile wooden frames a deadly combination of speed, stealth, and firepower. At their heart lay 3 Packard 512 gasoline engines, each producing 1200 to 1500 horsepower. Together they hurled these little boats across the water at over 40 knots, faster than any battleship or cruiser afloat. Their armament was equally startling for their size. Early PTs carried 4 21-inch torpedoes, Mark 8 models recycled from World War I destroyers. Each weighed nearly a ton and carried a 466-pound warhead. As the war progressed, the boats upgraded to the Mark 13 aerial torpedo, smaller, lighter, but devastating, with a 600-pound Torpex warhead that packed 1.5 times the punch of TNT. To fire them, crews simply rolled the tubes or launched them from racks over the side, often at ranges of less than 1,000 yards. It was close, dangerous, and breathtakingly bold. Alongside the torpedoes came an ever-growing arsenal of guns twin, 50-caliber machine guns in a turret, 20mm Oerlikon cannons on the deck, and later even 40mm Bofors and 5-inch rocket launchers. Pound for pound, by the end of the war, no vessel carried more firepower than a PT. The technology went beyond weapons. By 1943, most PTs carried radar sets, the compact SO or SO3 units mounted on A-frame masts. For the first time, small boats could locate enemy ships at night before they were spotted themselves. This made them ideal for ambushes, and for harassing Japanese supply runs the so-called Tokyo Express of destroyers and barges that rushed troops and supplies through the island chains under cover of darkness. But behind every PT boat were men who gave these machines their true spirit. Each crew numbered only 12 to 17, crammed into the narrow hull. Their living quarters were tight and hot, the air thick with gasoline fumes and the ever-present roar of Packard engines. Sailors often doubled as gunners, engineers and lookouts, each man knowing that a single shell hit could turn their wooden craft into a blazing coffin. Yet morale was often high. They were young, daring and proud of their Mosquito fleet, and they relished the idea of outsmarting and outrunning the Imperial Navy's giants. Japan had no equivalent. The Imperial Navy believed in big ships and heavy guns. Its doctrine emphasized decisive battle by battleship squadrons. When Japanese sailors encountered PTs for the first time, they were stunned that these tiny craft dared to dash at them, spitting torpedoes in the dead of night. They gave the boats nicknames Devil Boats and Rotenku, meaning sea wasps. While Japanese destroyers might unleash torrents of 5-inch shells at them, the PTs darted, turned and vanished into the night, leaving only confusion and sometimes burning hulks in their wake. Strategically, PT boats filled gaps the Navy had no other answer for. In the Philippines of 1941-42, as the Japanese closed in on Bataan and Corregidor, PT boats carried General Douglas MacArthur and his family through enemy-patrolled waters to safety, a mission of desperation that succeeded only because of their speed and stealth. Later in the Solomon Islands, PTs became the frontline pickets, the first to engage Japanese barges and convoys. They were not always successful torpedoes, often malfunctioned, and many a boat was sunk or burned, but they bought time-delayed supplies and forced the enemy to commit precious destroyers to escort missions. The cost was small compared to battleships. A PT boat cost around $300, barely more than a medium bomber aircraft. They were mass-produced in American yards by firms like Elko Higgins and Huckins. In all, over 500 PTs were built, with Elko delivering the majority. They ran on gasoline, consuming up to 500 gallons an hour at top speed, and carried around 3,000 gallons in their tanks. By war's end, many would be burned on Pacific beaches rather than shipped home, so cheap were they compared to the logistics of recovery. The Mosquito fleet soon proved that in war size alone meant nothing. At Guadalcanal, PTs prowled Iron Bottom Sound, stalking Japanese destroyers ferrying reinforcements. At New Guinea, they hunted barges, hugging the shoreline. By 1944, they were swarming through the Philippines, the first line of defense against Nishimura's southern force at Surigao Strait. They were everywhere, and to the Japanese it seemed impossible that America could field such numbers of these swift, stinging vessels. It was not just their tactical effect, but their psychological one. To Japanese sailors accustomed to decisive fleet action, being harassed nightly by devil boats was infuriating and unnerving. Supply convoys that once ran at will now required destroyer escorts and constant vigilance. And the PTs, aided by radar, were always watching. This was the backdrop to one of the most remarkable naval stories of World War II. Small, fragile boats manned by young crews would dare to charge giants of steel. Their courage would echo in the most desperate nights of the Pacific War, from the black waters off Guadalcanal to the decisive battles of the Philippines. And though they would never sink a battleship outright, their sting would change the rhythm of the war, slowing Japan's momentum, exposing its supply lines, and humiliating its mighty navy in ways no admiral had anticipated. The stage was set for a duel between speed and size, daring and doctrine, mosquitoes and monsters. The PT boats were ready to prove that in the Pacific the smallest vessels could make the biggest impact. The Solomon Islands campaign was one of the most grueling and chaotic series of battles of the entire Pacific War, and it was here that the PT boats first carved their reputation into history. In these waters, Iron Bottom Sound, New Georgia Sound, and the countless small channels between jungle-covered islands, massive Japanese destroyers carried supplies and reinforcements under the cover of night. The Americans called it the Tokyo Express. Against these sleek greyhounds of the sea, the U.S. Navy unleashed a strange, unlikely weapon: wooden torpedo boats crewed by a handful of young sailors, armed with a few torpedoes and an oversized dose of courage. The odds seemed laughable. A Japanese destroyer displaced 2,000 tons, bristled with 5-inch guns, and could hit targets miles away. A PT boat weighed barely 50 tons, built of mahogany and powered by gasoline engines so loud they could be heard miles off. Their four Mark 8 torpedoes, though powerful on paper, often ran too deep, missed their targets, or failed to detonate. Yet the PT crews pressed forward night after night, chasing shadows, laying ambushes, and firing torpedoes into the blackness in the hope of striking a vital blow. It was here that the PT boats began their trial by fire. They learned to fight in the shadows, creeping close to enemy ships and firing at point-blank range. Radar was still primitive, but the small SO sets began to give them an edge in detection. Crews adapted to the reality that torpedoes were unreliable, and so they armed their boats with more guns. 20 mm, Oerlikons, additional, 50 caliber mounts, and even field-modified 37 mm cannons scavenged from aircraft. The PT boats were slowly transforming into floating gun platforms, able to rip apart barges and small craft that threatened American positions. One of the most dramatic episodes came in December 1942, when PTs prowling near Guadalcanal clashed with the Japanese destroyer Teruzuki. The PTs darted in close, firing their torpedoes at ranges that seemed suicidal. One struck home. A massive explosion ripped through Teruzuki, setting her ablaze. She sank, taking nearly 200 crew with her. For the first time, the Mosquito fleet had brought down a destroyer. Word spread quickly. Japanese sailors were stunned that a small wooden craft could sink one of their proud destroyers. American morale soared. But these victories came at a terrible price. The PTs were incredibly vulnerable. Their gasoline engines made them floating bombs. A single shell could ignite the fuel tanks and turn the boat into a fireball. PT-109, commanded by a young John F. Kennedy, was famously rammed and cut in two by the destroyer Amagiri in August 1943. 2 men were killed instantly. Kennedy and the survivors clung to the wreckage, then swam miles through shark-infested waters to safety. Though it was a disaster, the story of PT-109 became legendary, an emblem of bravery and survival that would echo into American politics long after the war. Other boats suffered similar fates. PT-323, struck by a kamikaze in 1944, was torn in half, but remained afloat long enough for many of her crew to escape. The mahogany hulls, it turned out, could be stubborn in their own way, refusing to sink immediately, even when blasted apart. For the men who served on them, these boats were both fragile and surprisingly resilient. Night after night, the Mosquito fleet harassed the Tokyo Express. They rarely scored hits on the big destroyers, but they forced the Japanese to change tactics, to zigzag, to slow down, to waste precious time. More often, the PTs found themselves blasting barges, low, shallow craft that hugged the shore. The barges were hard targets for torpedoes, so PTs adapted by raking them with guns, turning night beaches into infernos of tracers and explosions. In some engagements, PTs destroyed half a dozen barges in a single night, starving Japanese garrisons of food and ammunition. The numbers told a story. The Solomons saw dozens of PT boats engaged in hundreds of nightly skirmishes. They lost men, they lost boats, but they kept coming back. For every torpedo that missed, there was another daring charge. For every boat lost, another was pushed down the ramp of an Elko or Higgins yard in America, shipped across the Pacific to join the fight. The Japanese began to dread the sudden appearance of PT boats in the dark, their wakes cutting across the moonlight like white scars, their 50 calibers chattering defiantly against impossible odds. Perhaps the greatest victory of this phase was psychological. The PTs showed that Japan's vaunted destroyers and cruisers could be challenged by something so small, so humble, and yet so fearless. They became a symbol of American ingenuity and audacity. Where battleships clashed in daylight, PTs fought in shadows, denying the enemy rest, reminding him that even in the darkest waters of the Pacific, America was waiting. The Solomon Islands campaign was the crucible that forged the identity of the PT boat force. No longer were they seen as mere experiments or auxiliary craft. They had proven they could take the fight to the enemy, inflict losses, and most importantly, sap the enemy's confidence. By 1943, the Mosquito fleet had earned its place in the U.S. Navy's story, a fleet of tiny boats that dared to defy giants, and in doing so changed the tempo of war in the South Pacific. By 1943, the Solomon Islands had become a bloody stalemate of attrition. Yet the PT boats had proven themselves as relentless predators of the night, and so the U.S., Navy expanded their role into the long, jagged coastline of New Guinea. This theatre was unlike Guadalcanal's narrow waters. New Guinea stretched for 1,500 miles, a harsh, jungle-fringed battlefield where barges, supply craft and small warships crept close to shorelines. For the Mosquito fleet, this was a perfect hunting ground. The PTs in New Guinea were tasked with interdicting Japanese barge traffic, a lifeline for enemy garrisons cut off by Allied air and naval power. The Japanese had begun to rely heavily on motorized barges to ferry supplies under cover of darkness, hugging the coastlines to avoid detection. Barges were small, low in the water, and difficult targets for torpedoes. But the PTs adapted. They bristled with more guns, 20 mm, Oerlikons on the bow and stern 37 mm, and even 40 mm cannons mounted on deck, and eventually 5-inch rocket launchers that could devastate entire convoys of barges in seconds. The shift from torpedo boats to heavily armed gunboats was well underway. Night after night, PT crews prowled the coasts of Hansa Bay, Wewak and Madang. Their engines roared as they sped across the dark waters, then fell silent as they throttled back to ambush unsuspecting barges creeping along jungle shorelines. At ranges of a few hundred yards, tracers slashed into wooden hulls, igniting fuel and ammunition. Japanese soldiers trapped aboard had no chance. Entire convoys vanished in bursts of fire, leaving the coastline littered with wreckage. One particularly fierce engagement came in early 1944 at Douglas Harbor. PT-120 and her squadron mates intercepted a barge convoy carrying Japanese troops and officers. The PTs tore into them with guns blazing, sinking or burning several barges despite heavy return fire from machine guns hidden on shore. The battle was chaos, flashes of fire lighting up the night, the roar of Packard engines punctuated by the staccato hammering of .50 calibers. Several American crewmen were wounded. Yet the boats pressed the attack, determined to leave no survivors. The Japanese troops were stunned that such small craft could unleash so much destruction so quickly. The PTs also acted as scouts and guides for larger Allied forces. During the New Guinea campaign, they reconnoitred beaches for impending amphibious landings, marking channels through reefs and reporting on Japanese positions. They often went in ahead of the main fleet, relying on radar and sheer daring to slip close to enemy-held coasts. In some cases, PTs guided destroyers and cruisers into firing positions, their reports directing naval gunfire onto Japanese bases hidden under jungle canopy. But the Mosquito fleet paid a price. PT boats operated on the razor's edge, always at risk from Japanese shore batteries, aircraft, and sudden ambushes. Many were destroyed outright by artillery or bombs. In these waters, the crews faced another invisible enemy disease. Malaria, dysentery, and tropical fevers sapped their strength, turning each mission into an ordeal not just of combat but of survival. Yet morale remained high. The men believed in their mission and in the strange sense of brotherhood that only came from living so closely aboard such small vessels. By late 1944, as General MacArthur prepared to fulfill his promise to return to the Philippines, PT boats were already on station. They played a vital role in the advance through the islands, raiding Japanese outposts, destroying small craft, and carrying out reconnaissance. In the Philippines, the PTs reached their greatest numbers and their greatest fame. Over 200 boats operated in the archipelago, fanning out across channels and bays to intercept Japanese traffic. At Mindoro, PTs attacked barge fleets under heavy fire from coastal guns. At Ormoc Bay, they prowled against Japanese troop convoys, sometimes engaging at ranges so close that American gunners could see the terrified faces of enemy soldiers in the searchlights. They also harassed Japanese destroyers, trying desperately to reinforce Leyte, though torpedo success was rare. Still, the PTs forced the enemy to expend ammunition and waste precious time maneuvering. The statistics reveal the scale of their work. Out of 531 pints boats that served during the war, 99 were lost, many in the Philippines campaign. These losses reflected not futility, but ferocity. The Mosquito fleet was always in the thick of combat where danger was greatest. The Japanese could not ignore them. Even when they failed to sink large warships, PTs disrupted operations, intercepted messages, and provided crucial intelligence. Survivors recalled the constant tension of these missions. They described creeping close to Japanese harbors, hearing music and voices drift across the water before unleashing sudden torrents of gunfire and slipping away into the night. They told of radar operators calling out contacts at impossible ranges of engineers, keeping engines alive under fire of gunners blazing away until their barrels glowed red. Every night was a gamble, life and death, measured in seconds, speed and daring. By the time the PTs entered, the Philippines in force, their reputation was cemented. Japanese troops dubbed them devil boats, and with good reason. They were everywhere, small, elusive, impossible to predict. The Mosquito fleet was not destroying the Japanese Navy outright, but it was eating away at the Empire's strength convoy by convoy, barge by barge, until even mighty fleets could no longer sustain themselves. From New Guinea's ragged coastlines to the stormy bays of the Philippines, the PT boats had evolved. No longer mere torpedo craft, they were now versatile hunters, scouts, raiders, and assassins of the night. They had become the Navy's blade in shallow waters, sharp, fast, and always ready to cut. And as 1944 drew to a close, they stood ready for their most dangerous and dramatic moment. Yet the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where their audacity would put them face to face with Japanese battleships once more. The largest naval battle of World War II, Leyte Gulf, was already raging when the PT boats received their most daring assignment. Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force was attempting to break through Surigao Strait and join the other Japanese fleets converging on the U.S. landings at Leyte. His column included 2 battleships, Yamashiro and Fuso, escorted by cruisers and destroyers. If they succeeded, they could pour heavy fire into vulnerable American transports and disrupt the invasion. Standing in their path was Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's battle line, 6 U.S. battleships, many of them veterans of Pearl Harbor now thirsting for revenge. But before Oldendorf's mighty guns could engage, the Mosquito fleet was sent forward. 39 PT boats fanned out across the narrow strait, their mission detect, delay, and disrupt the oncoming enemy. For the PT crews, it was a night like no other. Engines rumbled as they took up stations, small wooden boats spread across a black expanse of water. Radar operators stared into their flickering screens, waiting for the first echoes. Shortly before midnight, contacts appeared, large shapes moving northward, unmistakably Japanese warships. Orders were relayed in hushed voices. The hunt was on. The first wave of PT boats advanced, cautiously throttling back to avoid giving away their positions. Suddenly, searchlights split the sky. Beams of blinding white slashed across the waves, probing for the intruders. Then came the thunder. Japanese cruisers and destroyers opened fire, their shells howling through the night and smashing into the sea with towering geysers. The PTs darted like minnows, weaving and twisting engines roaring at full throttle. For every barrage, the little boats answered with speed and audacity. Torpedoes slid into the water, their wakes streaking toward massive silhouettes. Crews held their breath, straining to see if a giant would stumble. It was chaos. Radio transmissions crackled as PT skippers called out ranges and bearings. Enemy battleship bearing 010, distance 10,000 yards. These reports raced back to Oldendorf, giving him precise information about the Japanese approach. Though few torpedoes struck home, accounts vary from none to 2 possible hits. The very presence of the PTs disrupted Nishimura's formation. The Japanese were forced to maneuver zigzagging to avoid incoming torpedoes, burning precious time and scattering their cohesion. Some PTs paid dearly. Several were raked with shells. One was set ablaze, another destroyed outright. Yet their crews fought on. Survivors recalled the roar of 14-inch salvos landing so close that their boats leapt from the water. Shrapnel cut through decks, men were thrown to the floor, yet still the engines screamed forward and torpedoes were launched. One skipper later remarked, "It was like gnats biting a lion, but those bites drew blood." By 3 a.m., Nishimura's force, harried and confused, had been funneled into the killing ground. Waiting ahead in perfect battle formation was Oldendorf's line, 6 battleships, 8 cruisers and nearly 30 destroyers, their guns primed. The PTs fell back, having fulfilled their task. Then, in one of the last great battleship duels in history, Oldendorf's ships executed the classic naval maneuver, crossing the T. From perpendicular range, the Americans unleashed a storm of heavy fire. battleship Yamashiro was hammered by dozens of 14-inch and 16-inch shells, staggered and finally sank beneath the waves. Fuso had already been mortally wounded, splitting in two and burning furiously. Japanese destroyers died in futile charges, blasted apart by overwhelming gunfire. When dawn broke, Surigao Strait was littered with wreckage oil fires and the remains of Nishimura's proud fleet. For the U.S. Navy, it was total victory. Not one Japanese ship escaped. And though the PTs had not sunk a battleship outright, their fingerprints were all over the triumph. They had spotted the enemy, first reported their movements, and forced them into confusion before the decisive clash. For the young PT sailors, the memory was unforgettable. They had stared down giants in the dark, felt the earth-shaking thunder of battleship guns aimed at them, and lived to tell the tale. Their wooden boats, sneered at as fragile and expendable, had proven indispensable in the crucible of the Pacific's greatest battle. In later years, veterans recalled how surreal it was to see their radar contacts turn into towering columns of fire and steel, only to crumble under American firepower. They felt pride, awe, and disbelief that their tiny Mosquito fleet had played such a pivotal role in slaying giants. The Battle of Surigao Strait was more than a tactical victory. It was symbolic, the final duel of battleships in naval history, and a demonstration that speed, intelligence, and courage could topple even the mightiest war machines. For the PTs, it was the climax of their war, the night when gnats bit lions and lions fell. The smoke of Surigao Strait still drifted over the Pacific when the Mosquito fleet's reputation was sealed. Though they had not delivered the killing blows themselves, the PT boats had been the sharp eyes and reckless stingers that made the decisive ambush possible. And in truth, this was the role they had fulfilled across the Pacific: scouts, raiders, and relentless harassers who forced Japan to expend strength where it could not afford to. In the immediate aftermath of Leyte Gulf, PTs continued to swarm across the Philippines. They prowled the bays of Ormoc, Mindoro, and Lingayen, intercepting Japanese troop convoys that tried desperately to reinforce garrisons. Time and again, the Mosquito fleet cut down barge traffic, leaving enemy soldiers stranded, starving, and demoralized. For the Japanese, what had once been routine supply runs became nightmarish gauntlets. Barges had to creep along the coasts under cover of darkness, only to be illuminated by tracers and rockets as PT boats pounced from the shadows. Each loss was small in tonnage but immense in consequence, as isolated troops withered without supplies. The psychological effect cannot be overstated. To Japanese commanders, the PTs were maddening. How could America afford to scatter hundreds of these boats across every contested shore? How could something so small bite so hard so often? They became symbols of American ingenuity and abundance. A battleship was prestige, a PT boat was persistence, and persistence was what broke Japan. Strategically, the PTs reshaped littoral warfare. They demonstrated that a fleet did not need only heavy guns and steel armor. It needed speed, flexibility, and swarms of small craft that could appear anywhere, anytime. In doing so, they exposed Japan's vulnerability. The Imperial Navy, designed for one grand battle, was forced instead to defend countless convoys against countless Mosquito attacks. Each sortie drained fuel, ammunition, and morale. By 1945, Japanese sailors dreaded the silhouette of a PT as much as they feared the drone of an American bomber overhead. The legacy of the PTs was also personal. The boats became a proving ground for young officers who would carry the lessons of the war into peacetime leadership. John F. Kennedy's saga with PT 109, though, one of many such stories, elevated the Mosquito fleet into American legend. His survival, his leadership in saving his crew, and his later political career made the PTs synonymous with courage under fire. But beyond famous names, thousands of anonymous sailors remembered nights of terror and triumph, the blinding beams of enemy searchlights, the bone-rattling roar of Packard engines, the desperate cries of wounded shipmates. Yet their end was sudden and almost cruel. When the war was won, the Navy had little use for fragile, gasoline-hungry wooden boats. Hundreds of PTs were pulled ashore on beaches in the Philippines and burned in mass pyres. At Samar alone, 121 were stacked and set aflame, their mahogany hulls crackling into ash. Veterans watched in disbelief. These boats had carried them through hell, and now they were destroyed like scrap lumber. Only a handful survived to become museum pieces, preserved as relics of a forgotten fleet. Today, PT 658 inches Portland, Oregon still roars to life, its Packard engines echoing across the river as a living memory of the Mosquito fleet. Numbers reveal both their sacrifice and their impact. Of the 531 pints boats that served 99, were lost nearly 1 in 5. Thousands of sailors served aboard them, many never returning. Yet for the cost about $300,000 per boat, they delivered far more than their price in damage and disruption. Japanese records admitted the annoyance, even humiliation, of losing men and materiel to such small enemies. And for the US, they proved that industrial might did not only mean battleships and carriers. It also meant the ability to churn out swarms of wooden mosquitoes to sting the enemy night after night until his strength collapsed. The PT's spirit lives on in modern naval thought. Today's fast attack craft missile boats and littoral combat ships echo their philosophy: strike, quickly disappear, force a larger foe to waste resources. The Navy learned that shallow waters, cluttered archipelagos, and contested littorals demand more than big gun ships. They demand speed, daring, and the will to fight close. The Mosquito fleet taught that lesson in blood and fire. In the grand sweep of World War II, PT boats never sank a battleship outright, never shifted the balance alone. But their contributions were cumulative, grinding, relentless. They rescued generals, stranded pilots, and shipwrecked sailors. They scouted invasions, disrupted supply lines, and kept the enemy awake in dread of sudden attack. They were not glamorous compared to carriers or battleships, yet they were everywhere, ghosts in the night, roaring across black seas at 40 knots, leaving chaos in their wake. For America, the PT boats became a symbol of how a young, resourceful nation fought the war not only with massive firepower, but with speed, ingenuity, and sheer audacity. For Japan, they were proof that even the mightiest empire could be undone by countless small stings. And for the men who crewed them, they were home, weapon, and coffin all at once, a fragile wooden hull that carried them into history. Thus ended the tale of the Mosquito fleet, the devil boats of the Pacific. They were small, expendable, and often overlooked. Yet without them, the war across the islands might have taken longer, costlier, and bloodier turns. Against giants of steel, they proved that courage multiplied across hundreds of tiny decks could help bring an empire to its knees.